Thanks a lot, President Lenaerts, Professor Lenaerts. Thanks to Bart Politeia for organizing and inviting us all, and thanks to the Commissioner, Magnus Brunner, for joining us. There are a number of experts and friends from around Europe who've come here for the seminar we had at the Holland College. I would just like to highlight one person who's been an inspiration to the work of ESI in the last few years, Peter Omtzigt. We've worked a lot on the Council of Europe, and there was a time when there were not many willing to stand up to defend that institution, which went through some tough times. Defending journalists, a journalist killed in Malta, defending Polish rule of law, and also fighting the biggest corruption scandal in the history of the Council of Europe, the caviar diplomacy scandal. And at that time there were a handful of MPs who were willing to fight and stand up, and Peter Omtzigt was always one of them. So thanks a lot for this too. For the inspiration, I think one needs inspiration. And when we look at the European Union, of course, this system that Professor Lenaerts has just described, when one looks at this more closely, one would seem it's obviously a massive inspiration. And yet, we find it is difficult to communicate. And one needs to make this effort to every generation, including to those who are now young. And I think one way to communicate this is to try to understand the miracle of this system of dealing with power in such a big space of 27 member states, by looking at some of these experiences of how it's come about. And I'm very happy that my two daughters are here. One of them was gracious enough to allow me to write a book with her, which is coming out in a few months, on this European miracle. And for this book, we looked back at Luxembourg in 1952, when a few Europeans came together for the first institution, not far from where your court is today, in the Place de Metz. And we forget there was this German who came, who'd been fighting for 5 years in the Wehrmacht. In Norway, in the German invasion of Norway, in the Soviet Union, in France. He was taken prisoner. He was a prisoner of war of the Americans. He had worked in his previous life as a miner and as a lawyer. He then went back to Germany and set up a Christian Democratic Party with Konrad Adenauer in the Ruhr area, and then was sent as a commissioner to the first high authority for the coal and steel community, Franz Etzel. And he worked there with an Italian who had also been fighting in the Second World War for Mussolini, an Italian who was sent to fight in Africa against the British in El Alamein, who lost a leg, which was amputated, who then came back to Italy, to his home region in the north, who was celebrated by the fascists because he'd fought for the fatherland and lost his leg. But then, when there was a civil war in Italy, he sided with the king against Mussolini. He joined the partisans, he fought against the fascists and liberated the city. The Americans made him commissioner in his city in the north of Italy. He became a Euro-federalist and also joined the high authority. So we had these two ex-soldiers next to, of course, Jean Monnet, the Frenchman who went to America when his country became a dictatorship. He left France in 1940. He didn't stay there, and he tried to help the Allies restore democracy by working on rearming the West. And finally, there was the young man who was the General Secretary, a Dutchman, Max Koen. And what you described today about how the system works, when I look for people who can explain the European Union in very common sense terms, that is not complicated, not technocratic, this young man, Max Koen, always comes to mind. He was actually a student of history and finished his degree at the University of Amsterdam the day the Germans invaded, in May 1940. He had a Jewish father. He was taken prisoner. He was taken to a concentration camp in the Netherlands, a German concentration camp. And he then was for 2 years in a camp for hostages, which was a very peculiar place because you were living, he said, okay, but under the constant terror that if there was any attack by the Dutch resistance, people in that hostage camp were just shot in retaliation. And he emerged from this experience of the Second World War with this horror of the absence of the rule of law. I mean, he said this, when you don't have courts, institutions, all of this setup that human beings invent and then voluntarily live by, hell begins. Now, what is so interesting about that generation that created these institutions, that we still live with, that expanded, that enlarged to more than half the continent already. 27 of our 50 states in Europe, 27 are in the European Union. What is remarkable is a very profound lesson about power, because that very same generation that created those institutions, the Schumanns and others, Robert Schuman in France, also failed disastrously in another historical challenge, where they didn't apply the lesson they applied when they dealt with the former enemies, which was, let's get together, let's jointly agree on laws, let's treat small and big states as equals, let's make sure Luxembourg never has to fear Germany again, which of course was invaded 2 times as a neutral country. Let's agree jointly on rules, and then let's put ourselves voluntarily without the fear of force, because there was no force in the high authority. There was no police, no National Guard at that level. Let's voluntarily submit ourselves to the commonly made rules. This generation of the 50s disregarded these lessons and fought one colonial war after the other, in the vain belief that if you just send enough soldiers to Indochina or then later to Algeria, you can keep control through force. And all of these wars were lost. The empires of the European imperial nations disappeared, but the European Union, growing out of this first community, survived. And there is a very profound lesson, I think, in this about power. That in the end, this ingenious system where you voluntarily relinquish power, where you can't be forced, in the end you can even leave, as we've seen with the United Kingdom. This is not a system that keeps you entrapped. It's not an empire, as some scholars have called it. That this in the end survived and was stronger than all the empires of the world, including, of course, the Soviet Union. And it's an encouraging lesson in these days when there is a power in Moscow again, trying to enforce, by force, fighting again to retake control of what it considers former colonies. And I'm sure it will meet the same fate as the French met in Algeria and Indochina or other European imperial powers. And in the end, perhaps, the really encouraging lesson from European history is that this system, which is so unusual, where small states no longer fear big states, because of the rules that President Lenaerts described, that voluntarily, basically every day, by playing by these rules, big states signal to small states, neighbors signal to their neighbors, you can trust us, because we just play by these rules. This has been so successful that it grew from 6 to 12 to 15 to 27. And if we look at the last 3 decades, since I was a student, 1990, the end of the Cold War, what we see is that these 50 states of Europe, we really had a new division of Europe in 2. Because of these 50 states, we had 17 that had experienced war or civil war or massive political repression, state collapse. 17 of the 50 states of Europe. Yeah, Bosnia, Kosovo, Russia, in Turkey, Southeast Anatolia. The only one in the EU was in Britain, the Northern Ireland conflict, which was imported into the EU when the United Kingdom joined. 17 states with many wars in Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Croatia, North Macedonia, and you name them. There were 33 states which enjoyed for the last more than 30 years democratic peace. And who are they? 4 are microstates: Monaco, Andorra, San Marino, and the Vatican. Okay, they're in the middle of the EU. 4 are the Schengen states: Iceland, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, which are basically in many material ways linked closely to the EU. And 25 are EU member states, all the EU members except Slovenia and Croatia because before they could join, of course, they had wars on their territory in the former Yugoslavia. So the Europe, and I think this is a lesson about what this system does that you've described, of going to court and challenging each other by these rules. The Europe that we see is actually a Europe with, academics and universities like theories. I have just a very simple theory. The theory is you join the EU, it helps being in NATO, you will not have a civil war, you will not have political prisoners, and you will not be attacked. Now, academics like to challenge theories, but I have yet to find people who say this isn't a theory that explains something meaningful. And at a time, and I close with this, when this model is under attack, from outside, there are thinkers in the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again movement, who say, people influential with the vice president and the president, who say, small states who can't defend themselves really should disappear. You know, really, this is a world for strong states. Why should America help others? Breaking with the whole US tradition of helping this Europe that we've seen crucially emerge. And then, of course, much worse than this, there is in Moscow a power that not just talks about this, but actually attacks small neighbors to redraw borders. And then inside our societies, there are parties, and I live in Berlin, about one party that has now, for some weeks, even been number one in polls. Now it's again number two, which is good. The AfD, which has one of its most prominent politicians say, the EU must die so that Europe can live, last year. With all of these people who attack this structure and this European miracle, where big states give up power voluntarily and then we build this trust through cooperation, this miracle is at risk. So we need to remind ourselves what it is about. We need to understand it, we need to talk about it. Because in the end, and it's my last sentence, we've had 75 years since the first time in 1950 this idea was expressed in the Quai d'Orsay in Paris by Robert Schuman and written up by Jean Monnet. And it's such a cliche, you know, you see them, you see that in the museums, but in the end it was such a radical idea. The amazing thing is that this survived the empires, it's still with us, but the challenge is, will it be around for the next 75 years? And I will not be there in 75 years. Some of us are too old for that, but those who are young, and now people grow to 100, and certainly the children born today or born to us, they will be there in 2100. We are in the middle of this, 1950, 2025, 2100. Will we keep this miracle for the next 75 years? Will we be sure, and my daughter just came back from Kiev and they had 3 air alarms in one day, and that was a good day. Will we be sure that there will be no drones attacking our cities, that we or our children will not have to fight wars, and that we will keep our democracy alive? And this is the challenge, and this is why I'm so thankful also for Professor Lenaerts' explanation, because in the end, of course, first one needs to explain how this works, and secondly, one needs to make it work, and I think the court is one of the most impressive institutions, because courts always depend on other institutions to have power, and this is, in fact, the European secret. They depend on us appreciating and seeing what they do, appreciating a miracle that we too often take for granted. Thank you.